Fair enough. And this is mostly for, can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
This is mostly for new master gardeners, right?
Master gardeners and people who are getting started with gardening in Virginia. Although I think lots of people are curious about woody plants too. I mean, like even me, vegetable gardeners.
Does this count towards their recertificate or I don't know what the right term is.
Continuing education. Yeah,
okay.
It does count for continuing education in most cases. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so here we are. We're going to go live, and we'll just give people a minute or so to join us here before we have Joel Koci. How do you say your last name, Joel?
Yes, that's right.
Of VSU, who's going to talk a little bit about woody plants.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you. I'm a board certified master arborist and urban forestry extension at Virginia State. My major thrust of activity at Virginia State is getting the word out on the importance of woody plants, be it trees and also woody shrubs, for the built environment and their contribution, ecological services that they contribute to us in the urban area and also the suburban area, which is actually, we'll say, a derivative or an offshoot of forestry. Consequently, it's called urban forestry. And at Virginia State, I've been there about 5 years with extension in urban forestry and have worked to get the school on what is termed Tree Campus USA, which is similar to Tree City USA from the National Arbor Day Foundation. And if anyone is interested in becoming their locality, county and or city, becoming Tree City USA or Tree County or even Fort Tree USA, please contact me and we'll see about getting you that designation. Next, please. There are phrases that we need to expel from our vocabulary when we talk about woody plants. First off, plants do not heal. Animals heal. For the longest time, we have been giving plants anthropomorphic traits. We have said when the plant is responding to some a stimulus or some reaction done to the plant, we say it's healing. That isn't correct. Plants seal, they do not heal. Heal is replacing damaged cells with healthy cells. If plants healed, we wouldn't have hollow trees, we wouldn't have damage and the cankers in trees because they would replenish the damaged cells with healthy cells. Secondly, there is no such thing as plant food. Fertilization or applying chemicals to the soil is the minerals that are deposited on the soil. And these may not be needed depending on the soil sample that is taken and also the pH of the soil, because so often people use the term, I'm going to feed the plant. That is such a misnomer. And when they think that they are feeding the plant, they think they are helping the plant out by depositing the the minerals on the soil. And if the minerals are not needed by the plant, they're just going to be wasted and also washed right to the waterways, which are going to add in polluting. There is no such thing as feeder roots. There are 3 types of roots. Anchor roots, which is right next to the woody plant, called the buttress roots also. Conductive roots, which connect the absorption roots, not the feeder roots, absorption roots. They connect the absorbing roots with the buttress roots via the connective roots. And the last, actually, the 4th thing that we should stop saying about plants is the roots do not explore the soil, they exploit the soil. When we say they explore the soil, we actually give plants the ability to think. and of course they can't think. They respond to external physical stimulus. And it's a very common misnomer that roots grow deep and they mimic the top. That is not so. Roots grow where there's available air and water. Always keep in mind WANE, water, air, nutrient exchange, when you're thinking about roots and soils. Next one, please. Now, when I say the plants do not heal, they seal. The slide on the left is a newly, well, actually 2 years now, installed red maple in the spring. In the spring, the bark is very, it's called slipping because it's so moisture laden, and you can't really feel it or see it underneath the bark, but there's a water space, if you will, very subject to bruising. That's tree on the left was bruised in transport and in installation. The one on the right is its result after about 5 or 10 years in the growing site. It is never healed, it's only tried to seal the wounds. Uh, and it is because plants do not heal, they seal. As time goes on, they can also become more hazardous because the lever, that's the area above the break acts as a fulcrum. The distance from the fulcrum to the top is increasing in each year because increasing in height from the terminal growth. So the plant on the right and on the left, they have never healed, they've only sealed. Next one. Now, roots grow where there's available air and water. The reason why I chose to slide on the left is those young trees to the right of the new concrete, and that's very new concrete. It was put in the spring of 2019. That's where 80% of the root system was because there's very little growth on the roadside. Most of that growth is where the pavement was installed. Consequently, they have killed those trees by severing the roots to dig the footing for the concrete, and they have reduced the amount of root system for that plant to support itself for life because the roots absorb water and minerals that the foliage needs. They've also created a hazard situation because they've taken away the stability of the plant and its ability to withstand itself over the road there, to hold itself over the road. And it is not the depth of a root system, as you can see, as those on the right, that does the holding. It is the surface area, and it is the friction between soil and roots that create the holding. Now, when I say roots grow where there's available air and water, you can see how that big root paralleling the uh, brickwork, it's growing where the irrigation hits, and it's growing right at the surface. Air and water is available for it. And then further down, you can see where the root is cutting across perpendicular to the brickwork. There's available air and water there between the brick pieces, and the roots now are growing into the lawn area. Roots are opportunistic. They grow where their physical needs can be met with air and water. Next one, please. Now, there are three organs within a plant. There is the root system is one organ, the trunk and connective tissue, trunk and the limbs and the twigs is the second, and then the third is the leaf system. Leaves photosynthesize. They are autotrophs. They make their own food through photosynthesis. That is, the sugars that are made through photosynthesis come about from CO2 and water in the presence of sunlight. Chemical reaction. It's an energy trapping reaction that traps the energy and yields after the process is complete oxygen as a byproduct, along with the product of sugar, and it's the same sugar that we use to drive our machine to create the energy to drive the processes within a woody plant, or within all plants, I should say. And not below, but to the right is a simple leaf. That is a white oak leaf on a twig, and at the base of the twig is a bud. The next one, please. The um, leaves come in different types. There is a simple one, as such as the oak leaf, the maple leaf, and the poplars. And at the base of the petiole, which is the stalk that holds the leaf to the twig, there is a bud. That's how you can tell if a structure is a leaf or not. If there is no bud at the base of the leaf, then it is a compound leaf, such as the hickories, ash, and mimosa. They are all compound leaves. There's even some plants that have bicompound leaves, meaning that they have leaflets that are compound and then attached to a compound leaflet. Very confusing. But there's no bud at the leaflet. Okay, the bud is at the base of the petiole. Again, the stalk that holds the leaf to the twig. There is a bud right there. And again, here is written that the photosynthesis is water plus carbon dioxide in the presence of sunlight yields glucose, sugar, and that is the energy that drives the machine. Now, leaves have evolved to a point where they are specialized for the plant to grow in full sun or less than full sun. Rhododendrons will say, azaleas, their leaves have evolved in a way that they grow in less than full sun. They do not do well in Central Virginia area in full sun because the way the leaf is constructed, its anatomy, it does not photosynthesize efficiently in full sun. Even within now, let me back up a second. There are other trees or other woody plants such as the sourwood and such as the black gum that do well in partial shade. But everybody plants the dogwood in full sun, then they think that it is a full sun plant. But if you look in the wild where the dogwood actually grows, you'll see it in the margins, the edges of woods, and consequently it flowers best when it's stressed in the sunlight edge, and it doesn't flower on the shaded edge because it is more efficient to photosynthesizing, and it is manufacturing the sugars in the shaded side. When people plant dogwoods, for example, in full sun, they think that it's flowering so great because it's in full sun, it makes it healthy. It's actually just the opposite. The dogwood is actually stressed and it's flowering because it's trying to regenerate itself. Those that are shaded, they have better photosynthetic efficiency, and they are growing and are healthier even though they don't flower. So a lot of times we can't confuse health with flowering. Okay. And now the sugars produced through photosynthesis are we'll say, extraordinary in as far as there are 5 fates of the sugars that are produced. One is for growth, so growth for next year. And always remember, plants, perennial plants, not annuals, perennial plants are always growing for the next year. They are trying to synthesize enough sugars through photosynthesis for growth of next year. So in a woody plant, when they are photosynthesizing, they are depositing sugars within the woody parts of it for next year's growth. Okay, and they're using some of that sugar for the present year, yes. The second avenue of the sugars is for storage. Woody plants store energy. They store the sugars and turns it into a carbohydrate that is to be used at time of stress. That's one reason, or one reason why plants live as long as they do. They have the ability to store energy for use in times of stress. If you will, when the plant is stressed, it could be extreme cold, it could be extreme heat, it could be all sorts of environmental factors that cause it to be stressed. The woody plant, then will call upon the stored energy and will mobilize it within itself and carry it to the area of that plant that needs the energy at that time. The third and fourth avenue of the sugars is for reproduction, flowering and seed production. There's two parts to that reproduction. The flowering takes an awful lot of energy from the plant, and phosphorus is the important element for reproduction because of the expenditure of the energy to phosphorus. Just as us, when we metabolize our sugars within us, phosphorus is what drives our machine. The uh, flowering and the seed are the third and fourth avenue for the sugars. The final is defense. A lot of people don't appreciate this, but woody plants have the ability to defend themselves. They can make compounds within themselves that will thwart insects and diseases. And it is because of this ability to do that that helps the plant to gain the ages that they do. So the leaves are extremely important for this reason here, for making the food that drives the machine. Along with the chemical reaction, you have some anatomical features such as the stomates or the stomatas. They are pores on the underside of a leaf, and this allows gas exchange and water potential pull from the root system up. It is, if you will, plants draw water from the soil, and then by the loss in the foliage through the pores called the stomates, they create a water deficit gradient in the leaf, which is a lower concentration in the petiole, and then the water, to satisfy the balance between the two, the equilibrium between the petiole and the stomate, the water moves into the leaf, sets up a deficit gradient from the petiole to the twig. Consequently, then the deficit gradient moves water from the twig to the petiole to equalize it, to cause an equilibrium. If you will, the water moves up through the loss in the foliage. If you visualize a slinky going up the stairs as opposed to down the stairs, that's the best analogy I've ever been able to come up with. So if you could just think of the slinky, that's how the water moves within, from the roots all the way to the atmosphere outside the foliage. Now, the last part that I'll say about the foliage is they are shed. When they are shed, an abscission layer is formed at the base of the petiole. And this is a structure that prevents pathogens from gaining entry, because when you break something off, you leave an opening, and pathogens would have a free access to the vascular tissue if there was not a shield, if you will, that would prevent that. So the plant in the fall, or whenever, late summer, whenever they shed leaves, they have set a boundary between the petiole and the twig that was holding it. And this is all part of the longevity of the plants, because they have built up systems over eons of time that allow them to perpetuate themselves and to thwart off insects and diseases. Next one, please. This is a compound leaf. This is an ash tree. Uh, I have an ash tree that's called the Chief Seminole ash that was given to me a few years ago. And emerald ash borer is not founded yet, so it's still growing. But these leaflets on the midrib are connected to the midrib, but there's no bud where those leaflets are attached. The midrib is or the petiole is attached all the way at the twig, and that's where the bud is. Next one, please. This is a conifer. There's a loblolly growing up in with that ash. No, I'm sorry, that's a hickory there. That's a palmately compound hickory, meaning that the leaves originate all at the same point. The previous one, the ash, that's pinnately compound, where, if you will, is similar to a feather, where the parts of a feather come into the midrib along the main midrib. They all come off opposite one another. This hickory, all the leaflets come off like your fingers on your hand at one point. And in back is the conifer. That's a candle that you see. The immature, that's the growing bud that began to expand a week or so before the photo was taken. And each of those pine needles is held by a fascicle. And at the base of the fascicle is where you have the bud. So if you could say, in a lot of ways, that pines are compound leaves because there's more than one appendage in a fascicle, and the fascicle is what connects it to the twig. And it's an interesting thing on pine needles is that they are held for a certain period of time, depending on a species of pine. Some hold them for up to 4 years. So you'll have in a limb, you'll have 4 seasons of growth. The 5th season is shed in the late summer and early fall. And then the following year, that very rear area of the pine needles will be shed. So on a pine, if you see internal yellowing on a pine in late summer, early fall, that pine is doing properly. It's acting according to its species, and it isn't stressed, and it isn't a leaf loss or a needle loss. It's doing as it should according to the species. Next one, please. Now, stems, working our way down from the foliage or inside from the exterior in. The stems or the woody parts, they are secondary tissue, meaning that in 2019 a stem grew. Now in 2020, another layer of tissue will be laid on the 2019 tissue. And all stems of all woody plants have a predetermined growth pattern that can change with time. The most common one in the juvenile stage is excurrent, which means that you have apical dominance. That is, if you envision your Christmas tree, the Christmas tree it's sheared, of course, but it has apical dominance because all conifers do for most of their life. And that apical dominance subordinates the growth of lateral limbs. So you always have most of your growth at the top of the tree, and then it forms a cone in appearance. But this excurrent will change as the plant changes in life stages. It goes from apical dominance to decurrent, which is the loss of apical dominance, and that is like a rounded willow oak. As it matures, it gets more of a rounded shape. The same is very true for a sweet gum or a black gum or a birch tree. When they're young, they have extremely excurrent form, conical form, but as they mature, the apical dominance is lost, and then the decurrent form takes over, giving it more of a rounded shape or oval. Sugar maple is a real good example, and also a red maple. Then you have the bark. Coming from the buds, you have the bark, which is a preset defense barrier. And the bark acts as our skin, if you will. keeping things in and keeping other things out. Just underneath the bark, you have the phloem, which is vascular cells, downward movement of the sugars from the foliage to the root system, actually to the twig, to the limb, to the trunk, and then down to the root system. It's all continuous in the phloem, and that's a very thin layer, very, very thin. And then just inside the phloem is the cambium. That is a meristematic, one of the three meristematic areas. Pardon me, but I failed to mention the bud is a meristematic area. All buds are meristematic area, meaning growing points. And that's a bud is set as a growing point for the following year, or in times of stress, it may be called upon to go into growth before the next year. But for the most part, it's growing, a potential growing point for the next season. And the cambium is the cell layer, a meristematic growing point that initiates in the springtime the phloem growth to its outside and the xylem growth to its inside. The xylem is the water conducting tissue that, if you will, are open ended straws or open ended cells that are placed one on top of the other that carry water and elements and biological compounds also from the root system all the way to the top. Okay, so at the bark on the outside, inside you have, just inside the bark, you have the phloem, which is sugar conducting tubes that carry mostly downward sugar movement. Then you have the cambium, which generates the phloem on the outside, and the xylem that turns into wood on the inside. Okay, and the xylem carries water and compounds from the roots to the foliage. The pith, then, going inside the twig or the trunk or wherever, is the very center of the stem of the woody part, and that is a preset defense barrier. That is to stop rot from traversing the diameter of the plant. It generally stops rot at the radius, halfway through the stem. And the next one. This is a demonstration, or this is a illustration, I'm sorry, of the stem and the root relationship. That red maple on the left is where the phloem has been trying for a few years to get the sugars made in the root system down to the root, made in the foliage, made in the leaves, I'm sorry, trying to get the sugars down to the root system. And you can see the change in size from the part under the girdle and then the larger above the girdle, how the sugars just accumulate and accumulate there, and also how the root system cannot get enough water up to the top because of the size. Okay, the constriction is causing a smallness, if you will, or distortion of size between the two. That slide on the right, that by looking at the overall, what's called a visual tree inspection, you can see there's something wrong with the roots because of the dead wood in the top, and also, if you will, the stagnation of that tree in as far as height in relation to its girth of the trunk. And it doesn't show up extremely well here, but there are numerous sprouts. They're at the base of that linden. This is a linden that are there because of girdling roots. Girdling roots are choking off the flow of nutrients from the top to the roots and from the roots to the top. The slide on the left is what is happening at ground level on that tree on the right. Because the foliage, the woody tissue of the trunk and the limbs and the roots are the three organs. They need to all work in harmony for the overall to be in proper health. I just noticed something too, that house on the right, or on the left of that tree on the right, looks like it's sinking. Next one, please. All right, now the roots. I always term the roots being the base of the biosystem, and their functions are to anchor the plant, store sugars made into foliage, absorb water and minerals, and forms symbiotic relations with soil microbes. That is not always possible in the built environment. It happens more in the natural environment. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. Three organs: roots, stems, and the leaves, the three organs. They need to work in harmony. Okay. If one is off kilter, the other two are off. Okay. And roots grow where there is available air and water. There is no preset defense growth pattern like the stem has. Okay. If there was, plant roots could be growing very close to nutritious, we'll say very fertile soils and moist soils, but because they have a preset growth pattern, they can't get to it. That's how come tree roots, woody plant roots are available to exploit the soil. Okay. Now, in urban soils, there is reduced tilth or porosity because which reduces the growth because of poor plant health, because reduced quantities of air and water. The acronym WAIN, Water Air Nutrient Exchange, is very important here for this consideration because there has to be a very good diffusion within the soil of gases out of the soil and water and oxygen into the soil. And that's what the porosity helps, or the tilth helps in a forest soil and in a farming situation. The porosity is so important so the roots can get their adequate amounts of water and moisture. Okay. Uh, I have a lot of people tell me, well, this soil has been compacted for a long time. That's a chronic situation that the plant is responding to in very minute, poor growing situations over a period of time. And you don't see it until the plant reaches the point of no return, where it is already used up its stored energy and it just gives it up. And that's when the layman will see it. Also, I have had builders tell me, well, I've only had this soil on that root for about, or on that, under that tree for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. I say, allow me to put a plastic bag over your head for 2 minutes. Let's see how long that you live. And sometimes they get it and sometimes they don't. All right. Now, poor roots will really generate poor plant health, okay, because of reduced quantities of water and of minerals sent to the leaves, okay. Uh, Again, I don't mean to be beating a dead horse, but roots, stems, and leaves are three organs that give life to plants. And if one of them is not functioning at 100%, then the two are impaired and the whole will suffer. Next one. Now, roots relation to the canopy. The slide on the left is girdling roots on a pear tree that very late this winter, early this spring, on the winds that we've been having here in my area, that pear tree wasn't able to survive because the winds were too great and the girdling of that trunk from the girdling roots caused that plant not to have the stability that it needed. So the root system was the demise. And that can be attributed to nursery production practices and or installation practices, or a combination of the two. Because good tree management or good woody plant management begins at time of planting. And part of planting is choosing plants that have a healthy, good root system and aren't going to fail when the plant is of any size, or there's not a defect in the root system that's going to generate the situation on the left. Now, that on the right, uh, that's at a governmental building where the improper tree choice for that small root zone. You can see that island that that tree is growing in. And there is numerous research done on the healthiness and the disease-free plants that will grow in a certain given volume of soil. That willow oak needs a planting pit about 20 foot by 20 foot by 3 foot to have the root system grow substantially enough to satisfy the needs and requirements of the top throughout its whole life. That amount of root system that there is not sufficient to supply the top with what it needs because there's not enough surface area of roots to supply that top. The lack of foliage that you see in that tree, the dead ends, that's all dead wood. It's late summer, actually early fall. That tree should be resembling the trees in the back if it was healthy. But because it's going into early fall leaf loss and the amount of dead wood that's up in there, you know you have a root problem, and it's actually a limited root system is what is the cause of that situation. If proper planning had been done, proper planning as far as increasing the root zone or potential root zone, or choosing a plant that doesn't get as large, you would have a much more healthy tree, much less expenditure on maintenance, not only pruning, but insect and disease control. The unfortunate thing on woody plants is they don't show their demise until it's past the point of no return. Most laymen don't see the early signs. Most grounds managers don't see the early signs because they're more intent on getting the work done and not really studying the situation. The woody plants, for them to really become uh, sources of ecological services, which means that they are going to reduce stormwater. They're going to increase stormwater mitigation. They're going to reduce the amount of rainwater that is hitting the pavement. They are going to contribute to uh, filtering the air, taking out particulate matter so our air is healthier for us to breathe. And that includes carbon monoxide, ozone, particulate matter, dust, sand, different things like that, different particulate matters that they will take out of an area if they are healthy and sizable. Also, reducing the amount of, I'm sorry, increasing cooling effect. If there was a structure near there, if the tree is shading the structure, it's going to reduce the amount of air conditioning required during the summer, which is going to contribute to a more inhabitable and a livable area. And a lot of this begins at time of planning, not planting, but at time of planning. Okay? Um, this willow oak on the right, it's unbelievable. That tree is still there. This slide's about 5, 6 years old. That tree is still there. It's got a lot of nubs in it now where they've cut the dead wood out. It it's also wasting money. It's time to take that tree out, replant another tree, because a lot of people say, "Oh, I hate to cut a tree down." Well, if it's not serving the purpose, it's time to replace and go from there because trees are renewable. And if we plan better, we'll have longer lived, more serviceable, more beneficial trees. Next one. Now, this is an installed redbud. This is a history of a plant which is in poor health. A lady called me a few years ago regarding this tree, and she did her homework on the internet thinking that it had verticillium wilt. Red buds are very susceptible to verticillium wilt, which is a vascular wilt disease, soil borne. But the problem with verticillium, or the consideration of verticillium wilt, is it generally attacks one half of the tree at the start, at the very initial. And I asked her if it was a total discoloration and chlorotic leaves, and she said yes. And um, when I got out there, I mentioned to her, did this tree come in a container? She said yes. And this was a $300 installed tree. She paid $300 to purchase it and have it installed about 5 years before this photo was taken. Next slide, please. The slide on the left is what I saw at the ground level, the girdling roots. This is quite similar to that tree in the parking lot with the support guys that was put on it at time of installation. The slide on the right is I cut it longitudinally. You see how the girdling roots constricted that crown area. That's the transfer point between the roots and the aerial part of the tree. It choked itself off. For a few years, it lived because the girdling roots weren't a total constriction. There was room for nutrients to get up and die for a few years. But then the tree was actually dead, but living off of its stored energy. And 2 or 3 years ago, whenever it was that I was out at that site, that tree had enough energy reserves to put foliage out, but nothing then was able to come from the root system to replenish the foliage, pardon me, the stored energy that was depleted by the foliage of that spring. And I hope that makes sense. Maybe I'll repeat that. The tree was actually dead, but it had its last gasp when it exhausted its stored energy to put out the foliage of that spring. And very little water could get up in there to sustain the foliage, so it just dried up and died out. Okay. Now, those leaves were never shed. There was not enough energy in that plant to set a abscission layer. So whenever a limb or a area is holding foliage, we'll say brown foliage, you can generally consider it dead. But if there is no abscission layer, that tree died, and it was dead when it put the leaves out. There's one exception that I really need to make right here. Young white oaks and young beech trees, for some reason in their lower juvenile stage, they do not shed all their leaves until the following spring. So don't confuse those two trees, the young beech and the young oak, with brown leaves and them being dead. They don't form the abscission layer on those areas. And some oaks and beech will do it their entire life. They'll shed they'll shed the leaves above those brown ones that they hold, but come next spring, the new growth will push them off. And that's just one quirk of nature. Can't explain it. Next one, please. Soils. Again, one of our most important aspects of soils. Urban soils, they are extremely compacted. When a building is built, they have to compact the soil to 95% compaction, meaning it only leaves 5% pore space for air or water or whatever to survive in. Because of the low oxygen, low wane, water air nutrient exchange, you get poor growth, reduced soil microbe activity also, which reduces the tilt and the fertility. In a healthy soil, there is as much life in a cup of healthy soil as there is in New York City. The microbes or the soil food web that we don't pay enough attention to, we are starting. Uh, we're starting to really appreciate it and really push it. It is so important for the health of the plant. Uh, by the poor tilt, poor fertility, you get a slow increase of fertility and of tilt in the urban soils when you start to cultivate it. It takes so much longer to revitalize the soil as it does to desecrate the soil. You can desecrate it in one improper function. It might take you another 2 years to bring it back to where it was before it was desecrated by that improper function. By the compaction, you get less weighing, water, air, a nutrient exchange, and you get an increase in erosion, which is an increase of pollution to the waterways. We always have to consider the interrelationship that we have with the soil and the plants, the pavement, our living areas, so on and so forth. Now, in natural soils, which are very, very hard to find these days, because natural soils are actually deposited by floods, volcanoes, and windstorms. Modern soils are deposited by truck. Consequently, it's awfully unusual to find a natural soil. Uh, but in a natural soil, there is organic matter and also a thing called the soil food web, which is the interrelationship of microbes, funguses, and bacteria that generate the life in the soil and also the mineral availability to plant roots. Okay, and uh, the natural mulch breaks down the minerals in the organic matter along with funguses that build the soil up and allow the natural fertilization, if you will, and nutrient exchange of roots to the soil. And that completes the cycle, the circle. In our built environment, we interrupt the cycle by taking away all of the leaves in the fall, taking away the grass clippings when the grass is cut, and consequently, the elements in the soil that help to make those organic compounds are being removed. In essence, you're depleting the soil. If you allowed it to remain, there's a big push now not to rake your leaves, but chop them up with a mower and let them decompose and let them reestablish the organic matter in the urban soils. Next one. I'm getting close here. Okay. Urban soils on the left. Look at that pollution. Look at that runoff. And soil is still the number one pollutant of waterways. And the ions, such as the phosphorus and the iron and different pollutants, cling to the soil particles and are washed to the waterway. And this uh, uh, silt fencing, it is in such disrepair. The inspector should have had them written up numerous times because there's not even silt fencing on the downhill slope there. This is such a, let's say, a common example of how construction sites pollute, and this is non-point source pollution. If collectively this was reduced, we would have a cleaner waterways and the bay would really be helped out if everybody does their part. I'm from Northeast Ohio, and Lake Erie, when I was coming up, was a cesspool. Honestly, cesspool. The slide on the right is a uh, somewhat natural. It's a natural soil, but not original. But there is a mixture of pines and hardwoods and also organic matter. And the trees there will fight it out themselves for survival. And those pines, in a natural succession of the woods, the pines and the black locust and different species, what is called volunteer species or um, primary succession species, their niche is to build the soil for the future generations of the hardwoods. They're in the grand design of things, or in whichever way you look at things, there is a reason for everything, and there is a certain pattern, and we as people have got to understand the patterns and not think that we can control them because we can't. Uh, it's not better horticulture through chemistry. It's actually better horticulture and urban forestry through understanding and holistic, looking at the overall picture and understanding the mechanisms of what makes the natural system work, not trying to change it, but trying to live with it. Next one. Proper maintenance begins at time of planting. Now, every living organism has got three life stages: juvenile, mature, and overmature. Each has their own set of characteristics. And I'm getting set to run out of time, so I'm going to just go through this quickly. Right? Right, Devin? Am I getting close to run out?
You're fine, Joel. You can keep going.
Okay. All right. Okay. Can you go back one, please? Okay. Juvenile stage, 1/3 of a lifetime, a lifespan, characterized by vigorous growth, very adaptable, rapid aerial growth, large amount of dynamic wood. Dynamic wood is the stored energy from photosynthesis. It's a mobile sugar within the plant that can be translocated within the plant to a different area where it's needed. And as the plant matures from the juvenile stage may have 90% dynamic wood, that is clear white wood that is very high in sugar and very mobile, that can be translocated throughout the entire plant. As the plant matures, its amount of dynamic wood is being replaced by static wood, which is support wood. Because when the plant is young, its major goal is to get as much stored energy as it can to help it survive through times of stress that are coming. Times of stress are coming to everyone and every living thing. At maturity, when it's maturity, you generally have about 50-50 dynamic to static wood. And the growth rate slows, and also the growth pattern may slow also. And the static wood is non-living support wood, and that is very lignified and very hard wood. We've all heard of heart of pine flooring or heart of pine uh, paneling. Because of the waxes and the lignins, the compounds that are in that static wood is what makes it so durable, so rigid, and so insect and disease resistant. And that's what builders really claim, and furniture makers really love, because that wood is so durable. Now, over mature state, that is larger trees, and for the most part, they can become hazardous by their larger form and their defects, if there are any defects, because the weight of the wood can do a lot of damage just based on its size. And the growth rate is extremely slow, and the quantity of dynamic living wood to static wood could be 80% static, 20% dynamic. That's why older trees, just like older people, aren't very tolerant of sudden changes, aren't very tolerant of intrusions on their growing space. And it doesn't, it's okay, it doesn't, all righty. Next one, last one, the summary. Um, Whenever possible, use native plants, okay, because they have co-evolved with our insects, and also with our vertebrate wildlife. They have evolved, and the native plants provide cover for them, food for them, and habitat for them. Our major problem with animal loss is habitat loss. Okay, proper selection of the plant for the site is very important, because uh, proper selection, once it is installed and is established in that new site, it requires much less maintenance, because it is growing where it has ecologically and environmentally been coded to grow by the DNA that has been set within it for a long period of time. The I swear, if I see another crepe myrtle, I think I'll scream or maybe cut it down, because crepe myrtles are so overused. Sure, they're nice in the spring, in the summer. They are so insect laden, disease laden, maintenance laden. I'm sorry. Uh, we can find some other native plants that aren't as attractive, yes, but overall, ecologically speaking, they are more effective and serve us better than the crepe myrtle. And each year, this is important, each year the root system needs to grow enough to satisfy the growth potential from the aerial part. And each year, the aerial part needs to have enough surface area to photosynthesize substantial sugars to satisfy the roots requirement. Think of that tree in the parking lot with the small root zone. It never grew enough roots to satisfy the top. That's where the oscillating equilibrium is how a woody plant grows. Each year, the aerial part grows along with the root system, and they grow enough to satisfy the requirements of the other. So it's like a teeter totter going up and down, with the ground level being the fulcrum. And the teeter totter is going up and down, and the other side is satisfying the other, so it can go up and down. This oscillating equilibrium allows the plant to survive. If you run into a situation such as that oak tree in the parking lot where they're both the same, the plant is dead. It is just a matter of time before it's finally lost. Chronic disorders versus acute disorders. Acute disorders would be a few years ago when we had the fall cankerworm that came out in the early spring and devoured foliage, or oh, name just jumped out of my head. I'm sorry. Uh, the bagworm. We've all seen bagworm in July and August, how they devour an entire evergreen. That's an acute disorder. You see it, you can react to it. By the time you see the bagworm, it's actually too late, but you see it. The chronic disorder is similar to a smoking. If someone smokes for 10 to 20 years, they're fine. The 25th year, they get cancer. It's from the chronic smoke inhalation over a period of time. Compacted soils, improper aerial atmospheric conditions for a plant can create chronic disorders. And those are small intrusions on the photosynthetic potential, which in turn is going to cause a problem, but it's not going to show up in the juvenile stage, it will show up in the mature stage. And I guess we have time for a couple of questions.
Yep, we have a couple questions here. One is, I have a dogwood tree that seems to wither, but is watered and is mulched properly. Is there anything else that you would recommend to support a dogwood tree that seems to be suffering?
Have you taken a soil sample? Because the pH could be off, and if you're putting now, let me back up and ask, how's it suffering?
The comment just says seems to be withering, so I guess wilted.
It could be insect, it could be disease. It's hard to say. Sampling is the best thing. Take a twig at least 6-8 inches long of the withering part, and it could be a disease, it could be a twig borer in the twigs, it could be lawnmower damage. There's all sorts of things. If it's overall like that red bud, then it's a root disorder. Or if it's a section, then it's that one section. It's hard. Through conversation, it's awfully hard.
Yeah, it is hard to tell. And so if you have specific questions like that about specific trees, you can always contact your local extension office and master gardeners. And if you send a picture to them, they can sometimes help you diagnose.
Pictures aren't that good with plants because how can I put it? A lot of people try to send me photos, and I really prefer sending a piece. Or give me the address, and I'm not opposed to coming out and having a look at it.
That's a really good point, Joel. And some extension offices can sometimes do samples if you have a disease problem.
Yes.
Through the cooperative extension.
Yeah.
A couple other questions here. Do you have any recommendations on protecting trees from cicadas? So, and I'm sure you can talk to this more, but cicadas aren't, for most trees, cicadas aren't going to be a huge problem. Is that right, Joel?
Correct. They are mostly um, hearing objection. But the female will ovideposit in twigs the size of a pencil her eggs, and then during a wind that those will break off, and then the egg goes down to the soil, and then it spends 17 years in the soil. So they're more unsightly and audio problems than tree problems.
Another question here. It looks like somebody has a crepe myrtle that was cut down so maybe topped, and now it's got a lot of suckers coming out. What would you recommend for helping a crepe myrtle in that condition?
Well, to be honest with you, I would cut it down entirely and replace it. Okay. But if now, when you say suckers, suckers come from the root system. Okay.
Mhm.
And if that's what she's referring to, there's not much that can be done.
Yeah, I'm not sure if she means suckers or water sprouts.
Exactly. Right. Right. Because with plants, we've always been dealing with improper common jargon. Suckers actually come from root system, but yet everybody calls everything a sucker, and it's not accurate. So it's hard to really say.
Can
I
you
don't mean to be vague,
Mhm.
but
Could you maybe talk about what a sucker is versus a water
okay,
sprout?
sure, sure. A water sprout will actually happen if you over prune aerial part of a tree because you've disrupted the root to shoot ratio, meaning the surface area of foliage. The plant, because of hormonal action, knowing that it has lost so much green material, photosynthetic potential, will differentiate cambium cells and turn them into vertical growth cells to set the foliage out to reestablish the amount of photosynthetic potential. Does that make sense to you?
Mhm.
Okay. Because it's the plant knows by hormonal action, by the over pruning, that it's lost a lot of green material. And by its survival mechanism, it's going to reestablish that surface area of green material for photosynthesis. And not much can be done. Um, the reason why ISA recommends or best management practices no more than 25% green material pruned out of a tree, of a juvenile and mature tree, at any one time, is because you don't want to upset that root to shoot ratio. And only 10% of green material on an over mature tree should ever be pruned out because you disrupted the plant's own equilibrium within the root system and the top. So those are water sprouts that originate after over pruning. The suckers come from root system, and they can come from mower damage. They can come from varmint eating on the roots, all sorts of things, because there's an accumulation of carbohydrates, and then the plant has the ability to differentiate cells and create a growth cell from a root cell, aerial growth.
It does. It looks like this crepe myrtle does have it's water sprouts. So could
Okay.
you maybe recommend if you have any kind of tree that has been over pruned and now has a lot of water sprouts, how should you address that?
You have to let it go for a long period of time, about 3 to 5 years. Then come in and remove 1/3 of the water sprouts in the late summer and fall, because then the physiology of the plant is everything is going down to the root system. If you were to do that in the spring, when you make one pruning cut, 3 other sprouts would originate from that cut spot. So do it in the late summer and fall, using the plant's own phenology and life cycle to your advantage.
Okay, a couple more questions. One, could you recommend some trees that people could plant as an alternative to Bradford pears?
One that is really overused, pardon me, underused is well, there's actually the Bradford Pear now has got a Cleveland eye, and there's another cultivar out that has got a better growth form. So you don't have to discount the Bradford Pear entirely. Those are improved varieties. But then there is for the spring flowering, early spring flowering, the, give me 1 second, please. The name just jumped, it's shadbow, the shadbow tree, or the June serviceberry. The shadbow is actually a horticultural indicator. When the shad are running in the creeks, that's when that flowers. The pioneers and the Indians used that tree flowering in the woods to let them know when to go shad fishing. But the shadbow, it's also called a serviceberry. It's Amelanchier, is Amelanchier arboreum, I think is the full name. Another one in the early spring, that would be my first choice. I can't think of another other than some of the oriental cherries wouldn't be bad.
Okay, and let's see, one more question. So could you recommend a book or maybe some kind of resource if people are looking to be able to identify trees that they see in their yards or when they go out into the woods?
This is unbelievable. Tech has got an app. I forget the name of it. I think it's Tree Indicator. Are you familiar with that app? But it's on a smartphone, and it's Tree ID. Virginia Tech Tree ID goes on an app. Another one is there is a from National Arbor Day Foundation has got like a spiral bound, if you will, flashcards that show different trees, and I'm pretty sure they sell it through the National Arbor Day Foundation, and if not, International Society of Arborists has got a list of publications, and they have a tree ID book in there that is throughout the U.S. It's not just Northeast or Southeast, but throughout the U.S. International Society.
That sounds like a really good resource, Joel.
Okay. All right.
So I want to say thank you for sharing some of your wisdom with us today and helping us learn about how to take care of woody plants. Next week, we're going to sort of pivot back to vegetable gardening. We're going to have Chris Epps talking about how to water. So that's going to be very helpful as it starts to warm up. And it's funny to think about watering right now as most of the state is like flooding. But Chris Epps is going to join us to talk about proper watering methods. So we hope that you will come back here and join us next Thursday at 2. And I'm going to say thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay.
How was that?